I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Dominique Brezinski. I'm a security engineer at Amazon. And not on the docket tonight is my co-presenter, which is Steve Hoffmeyer, and he's the chief scientist at Santa Security. So, hold on one second as I navigate my funky slides. Whoa, wait, we don't want to do that. All right. So, if you noticed on the website, I said I was going to talk about stuff I'm not going to talk about tonight. I'm actually going to talk about half of what I was going to talk about. So originally I was going to discuss the fact that if you really break down the attack versus the defend cycle as it stands today, and even if you constrain it to the fact that, say the attackers aren't looking for new exploits, but they're just sitting around and waiting for patches, and they just want to reverse engineer the patch, find the problem that's in it, or maybe some other problems that were patched silently in it, and either use those to attack in the site or to release the exploits for it. And then you look at the defense cycle that the defenders have to go through, downloading the patch, testing the patch, applying the patch, that actually the attackers win a lot more of the time. But I kind of think that that's beating a dead horse if you've seen Halvar's talk or any of these other guys and looked at Metasploit. So I'm just not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is essentially anomaly detection and how to take anomaly detection and extend it to doing automated response at least some of the time in order to really cut down on both the financial costs of attacks but also just to stop a certain subset of attacks from actually even taking hold in the system. And so this is a little theoretical at times, or a little academic. I'm actually going to give, Steve and I are both going to kind of give an overview of sort of the state of the art in anomaly detection, both sort of academic and in practice. And then we're going to talk about attributes, just generically, that these systems should have and where they can go. And I'm going to wrap up about talking about a little open source project that I'm working on to try to let people play around with this stuff on real systems and just sort of get some feedback and see if some people come up with some great ideas. So, really it's just trying to just stimulate some people and get some people to think about some stuff. And there's also some dogma in the space, and a lot of people actually don't understand certain attributes of anomaly detection. And so we just want to kind of try to bring a little bit of clarity to those. And so a lot of what I'm presenting is actually built off of a lot of other very smart people's academic work. One of them's right here. And I'm happy to have them here with me. So my justification for this whole sort of thing is that I always assume that there's another entrance vector out there, meaning there's another attack that I don't know about, that I don't know how to defend, and I don't know what it actually, the component that is affected by it. So I have to assume for my defense model that, there are things that I don't know how to protect against, and I don't know what they are. And so I sort of view that there's two ways to deal with that. You can either essentially go the route of trying to develop your operating systems and your applications so you're minimizing the scope of a vulnerability or an exploit, i.e. doing privilege separation, a la like OpenSSH at this point, trying to constrain the privileged code to much smaller pieces of code, things like DJ, or Dan Bernstein's DNS and Qmail do these, many little components, all the way to mandatory access control systems. There's not many normal operating systems that do this stuff, but things like Secure Computing's Sidewinder firewall, have actually been able to constrain things when there's a vulnerability in SendMail. Even though it ran it, SendMail could get compromised, but you just couldn't do anything on the system. And so that's one approach, and that's something that you have to kind of engineer from the ground up, both building operating systems and building applications. It's kind of hard to retrofit all that stuff into the system, but it should be done. So the other thing that we can do, given that we have a lot of software that's running and we're not going to change, is to try to go to sort of detection and response systems that, given that there is vulnerable software, that it's going to recognize when it's exploited and try to mitigate some of the effects of the exploitation. And the implications come in this. I sort of view signature-based detection, anything else like that, if you actually know that there's common attributes that represent an attack and only bad things should cause these to happen, my idealistic sense is just fix that. Make it so it can't happen, right? And it's sort of like the no exec stack thing. It's not perfect, but you generally don't need it, so you should not have executable stacks. And there's many things that represent that class of things, and hopefully we'll just, as an industry, knock them off one by one, and they'll be more broadly available. So I propose that automated detection is actually just not enough. And anybody who's seen, I hate Gartner reports, but the Gartner report of why IDS is dead and a bad place to spend your money. So there's some validity in that notion. They were specifically talking about network IDS, but they weren't very clear about that. But the notion of if you purely just have a detection system, great, told you there's something wrong. It still costs you money. You still have to run around and clean up the worm, or you still have to go do forensics on the system, or you still have to figure it out and patch it or do whatever you're going to do to mitigate the issue. All this thing is just telling you is that there's more work to do. The very poor return on investment. But if you have a system that, at least in some cases, can implement a response policy that can stop the spread of worms or stop an attacker from taking a foothold on the system, or at the minimal case, get you a much better set of data so you can figure out what exactly is going on the system and what might be a good response for humans to take to it, whether or not they need to patch, whether or not they need to turn off a service, whether or not they need to firewall a system off. That at least gets better, and it gives you more operational context. This is all about just being able to, in a real world, do security that costs you less and keeps your business up more and keeps your private information safe. It's not talking about making impenetrable systems, because we don't know how to do that. So the other thing is that given a detection model, whether or not signature-based or anomaly-based, there's a ton of information available on a system, on a host, that can be evaluated at the time of the anomaly, that can give you a really strong indicator in many cases of whether or not this anomaly or this detect is actually malicious, is actually something you care about, and whether or not you should bother to operate on it. And then furthermore, it can help sort of classify the severity of that can potentially be mapped to response mechanisms. So that's kind of the idea. So the model is essentially detection, what we call co-stimulation, and that's sort of a immune system metaphor, and essentially just being able to evaluate other attributes or co-stimulators that are related to the event, and then based off of that, take an active response. And I know for a long time people have said, like, whoa, you don't want to do automated response to intrusion detection events. And that's very true when your automated response was basically reset snipe a connection or update a firewall. And especially going off of network data where the packet could easily have a forged source address, and it could cause essentially the response to create a denial of service or cause significant problems. But where we want to go is essentially have much more granular response mechanisms that can possibly be chained and be able to do these on the host, and we'll get into a bit more what those could look like. So the logical components are anomaly detection algorithms, relevant system and process attributes that can be used as the co-stimulators, and the algorithm to take and combine all those things. So a model that can be built either on an automated sense or can be defined from a profile perspective on when a detect occurs, what to evaluate on the system that has a high correlation on whether or not determining this is actual exploitation of the system, whether or not it's a denial of service, or whether or not it's potentially a false positive or something you just don't care about. And then actually having response mechanisms that can work within your environment. So we've got some possible anomaly detection. Let me get my cursor over here for a second. So some possible anomaly detection algorithms, and this is sort of covering what's been going on in the academic world for almost 10 years now. And this is all decidedly host-based, and I can talk about my bias, privately if anybody wants to dispute whether or not host versus network is the right place to do these things. But some possibilities include profiling short sequences of system calls. So this is, for instance, you're looking at a particular server. Let's just say you want to protect SSHD into a box. And it's basically profiling like a sliding window of sequences of system calls. And system calls are essentially how userland software actually gets access to resources like files, like memory, and like network connections. So though you can do a lot of stuff in userland, fundamentally if you want to talk to something off the box, you want to access memory someplace else, or you want to load a file off the file system, you have to make a request to the kernel, and you do that through system calls. And so essentially by profiling the system call usage from an application, you can get a sense of what the application does under normal conditions when it's doing what it's supposed to do. There was an academic work from the late 90s called PH, or maybe the early 2000s. It was against Linux 2.2, so it's not actually a useful code base, but it was trying to implement one of these models of profiling short sequence system calls. Another one is system call self-distance, which is actually from a recent PhD, and a guy named Jeffrey Underkoffer. And very interesting model, has a lot of promise, and it's a little too detailed for me to go into exactly how it works, but it's essentially statistically looking at the density of system calls within a window, and he was able to very accurately profile how a given application would use it. Another one was system call flow graphs, which actually was presented earlier yesterday. And that's just another way of looking at the possible relationship of system calls over time from a process. Another one is semantic constraint violation. And that's just sort of my funky term for things like systrace, where you're actually building a profile of what system calls an application can use and what arguments can be used with those given system calls. And the idea is you're trying to semantically understand how the application uses each system call. But the thing that doesn't do is have any sense of what system call should be called after the given system call and previous to it. So it's a very atomic view of what's going on, and that leads to some problems I'll talk about in a little bit. Then a broad open set is various combinations of supervised and unsupervised learning techniques. Off-host on a network, Stefano Zanero, I think, spoke just 1 or 2 slots ago about some of the work he's doing in that space. It's very interesting. And then what most current IPS products do is what I kind of call loose signatures, and that's where instead of writing a very exact signature match for a given attack, they've tried to look at what are sort of base attributes of a class of attack. So what do commonly a lot of stack-based buffer overflows try to do? Or what is executing a shell from a process that normally wouldn't do it, sort of, let's write a signature for that. And it's not anomaly detection in a true sense, and it's not learning. It is a human, somewhere describing some attributes of things that probably shouldn't ever occur. And that gets back to my first model. If we know that they shouldn't occur and they really have a strong correlation to attacks, well, we should probably try to go fix those. Be a good thing to do. Each method has its strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to get into that a little bit, but actually I'm going to give Steve the reins here for a bit, and he's going to go into some more detail about the actual anomaly detection algorithms and address some of the weaknesses that have been pointed out here and there. I'll pick that up, so let me get his slides up here for a second. I love extended displays on Windows. They're a real pain. Yeah. Can't see down there. Oh, wait, there it is. There we go. You're going to have to look at that.
All right, thanks, Tom. So what I'm going to do is just talk a bit about give you kind of a whirlwind tour of some issues in anomaly detection, specifically related to sequence of system call approach, things like that. It relates very much to what Dom's describing and some of the software he's going to describe later. So what I'm going to do is talk for about half an hour, and then Dom's going to come back in and talk some more. So we're going to take questions right at the end of it all. So one of the first things you've got to think about if you're trying to either build an anomaly detection system or you're trying to evaluate an anomaly detection system is to consider what the characteristic is that the anomaly detection is based on. And this is very important. You should choose a characteristic that, and by characteristic I mean things like, say, network traffic patterns or these short sequences of system calls, which Dom mentioned before. And so there's two very important principles you want to capture in the characteristic. The first is that the characteristic should give you a very stable, compact definition of normal. And that definition of normal should be easy to either define manually or some other way, or easy to collect. And it shouldn't change a lot. It should be relatively static. Or if it does change, you should have easy means of adapting to those changes. The other important thing, of course, is that this characteristic should be perturbed under abnormal behavior. So you should be able to detect attacks using this characteristic. So what do I mean by, what would be an example of a bad characteristic? Well, one example would be potentially the sequence of, or the typical commands that a user executes on a system, say like on a shell command, because users are inherently very varied. They tend to do new things all the time, and it's very difficult to get a comprehensive, compact profile of normal from user behavior. So the first example I have here of a reasonable characteristic in some circumstances is that of in the network traffic domain. So one of the things you can do is you can characterize traffic by looking at the source, the destination, and the port over which the traffic happens. And obviously this only really matters if it's a traffic that uses ports specifically. This kind of anomaly detection can be very effective if you have applied to an internal network where you have fairly consistent behavior. You have people connect to other machines on a pretty repetitive, regular basis, and they don't do a lot of random connections. And it can be very useful for detecting things like worms that have unusual behavior, like they suddenly start propagating wildly over your internal networks, or perhaps they start scanning other hosts, things like that. And this approach was first talked about and demonstrated way back in 1991 in something called the Network Security Monitor that came out of UC Davis. And subsequently, it's seeing very successful commercial use in systems like Arbor Networks' peak flow system, which uses it for a very effective detection of worms that spread to internal networks. But there are limitations to looking at network traffic, because network traffic is essentially data. And there are limitations to looking at data as opposed to the way that the data is interpreted or the behavior at the other end of the data. The first of limitation, of course, is that data can be spoofed. So I can forge the addresses to the packets. I can try and fool the detection system. I can generate a lot of noise by just spoofing packets, potentially sneak an attack through. Obviously, it's harder to do this if within your internal network you've got some sort of switched network and you can monitor the traffic that comes out of each machine, and you know it's coming from that machine, so you know if the machine's behaving badly. The other thing is that data can also be misinterpreted, and this is a more subtle point about data, but the fact of the matter is that the application that you're trying to protect, which is fundamentally what's happening at the back end, has to take that data and interpret it in some way. And a very crude example would be a system that's recomposing fragmented packets. Now, the network detection system may expect those packets to be recomposed in a pretty standard, normal sort of TCP way. But if your machine's got some sort of funky stack and recomposes them in some slightly unusual or buggy manner, and the attacker knows about that, the attacker can exploit that to evade the detection system. So looking at data in that case has its limitations. And the final thing, of course, is that data can be encrypted, and we're all aware how the perimeter is sort of disintegrating, and one of the consequences of the disintegrating perimeter is that data is becoming more and more encrypted over your internal networks. Now, one of the things you can do if you're looking at the data is try and decrypt the data at your network access point and then encrypt it again afterwards, but that runs into all kinds of problems with key distribution and knowing what the encryption protocols are and decrypting those. So there are very powerful reasons for looking at behavior, not data. And one of the ideas I'm going to talk about that can be used for doing anomaly detection on behavior is looking at the ordering or the sequence of system calls. And this idea, as Dom mentioned, is quite old. Myself and a group of other researchers at the University of New Mexico came up with the idea in about 1995. And the idea here is that you look at not particularly what are the parameters to system calls, but the sequence in which those system calls are executed. And this can be very effective for programs that exhibit repetitive and regular behavior. And a classic example would be a server program, because a server program is typically designed to do a set of tasks repetitively. And each of those tasks that it executes is some path through the program code. And that path through the program code corresponds to a set of sequences of system calls. And so under normal behavior, the server will give you a compact, stable definition of normal in terms of the sequences of system calls. This characteristic also fulfills one of the other requirements for anomaly detection, and that tends to be perturbed when something unusual happens, when someone attacks the network. And the reason it gets perturbed is because you tend to force the application to do something that it's not normally doing. You force it down an unusual code path. So obviously, a very obvious example would be a code injection through a buffer overflow. A less obvious example would be, say you have an application and your developers, in the process of developing the application, put some debug functionality into it so they could connect to the application easily via some sort of back channel and query it. And when they put the application out in the real world, they forget to turn the debug functionality off. Well, if that debug functionality is not being used in your normal behavior because it's not necessary for the normal operation of your server program, then as soon as an attacker exploits it, it'll be an unusual code path that will be detected by the system. And obviously, with any defensive system, there are potential ways of evading this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these ways of evasion in some future slides here. So given that you have a characteristic that can give you a nice definition of normal behavior and can also detect attacks, how can you model this characteristic? What is the best way to build up models of normal behavior? Well, there's a whole plethora of methods that have been tried, anywhere from n-gram to the short sequences of system calls that Dom talked about, to even more sophisticated methods such as hidden Markov modeling or various kinds of data mining methods. And typically what you tend to find when you look at these methods is that the more sophisticated methods do improve discrimination between normal and abnormal somewhat, but at quite an expense because they're much more computationally expensive to implement and to run. And this is one point that I want to emphasize, given the title of the talk, is that it's very important that your system can react fast and can do this kind of detection fast, especially if you're talking at this sort of low level inside the kernel, looking at the system calls. And so very complex algorithms that may be somewhat more effective are not really an option. So there are many different ways as well of building this model. So not only are there many different kinds of models, but there's many different ways of gathering the data to build a model. And the first way, which may seem the most obvious, is to do some sort of automated scanning of the binary or the source code. Now obviously if you have the source code, it's an easier problem, but in the real world, a lot of the applications you may be interested in protecting, you won't have access to the source code, and so you'll have to do binary analysis. The problem with both binary and source analysis, however, is that if you're doing it statically, you only have limited information about the transfers of control within the program. And a lot of those transfers of control may be dynamic or indirect, and you don't know where they're going within the static program. And you'll never know where they're going if you come up against the halting problem, essentially. And so if too many of these control transfers are indirect or dynamic, then you will get a very incomplete picture of normal, and you'll get, you may get no false positives if you define normal this way, but you'll get a lot of false negatives. You won't get a very comprehensive picture of normal. The other interesting thing is even if you do manage to somehow overcome this problem of dynamic control transfer, and you can somehow find out statically what all the control transfers are, you still get a superset of the behavior you're really interested in protecting. And a classic example would be what I mentioned in the previous slide was the debug exploit example where someone had left this debug functionality in a server. Well, that code is in the source, or it's in the binary, and so it's going to look like normal if the attacker exploits it under this method. So another potential way of trying to build the normal profile is getting human experts to try and define what these sequences should be. And I think this is a completely untenable approach. If you look at the absolute tangled mess with which these sequences of system calls are linked together, you'll see that there's no real way for human expertise to deal with this issue. So that leaves you with a third approach, which is trying to learn what the model will be. And you can learn in various kinds of environments. Basically, you let the program run, and you observe what sequences of system calls are being executed, and you record those, and you build up a profile of normal. One of the best ways to learn is if you can learn in a QA environment. And it obviously depends on you having some sort of QA process that is comprehensive and that you feel good about. Now, if you have such a QA process, it can be very useful because you can get a comprehensive definition of normal easily within the normal operations of your system. And in addition to that, the system can be very useful for telling you about problems with your QA process, because if you detect something unusual in the real world, it could, in your production environment, it could mean that it's malicious, or it could mean that it's something you just haven't included in your QA cycle, and you may want to include it in your QA cycle. And finally, if you don't have a comprehensive or very good QA process, you can potentially do your learning in the production environment itself. And the good thing about this, of course, is that you'll get highly accurate detection because you're very finely tuned for the local usage and configuration patterns of whatever application you're profiling. On the flip side, you have to take the time to learn, and there are issues around that. So this is a little graph to give you an idea of how this kind of learning method can happen. And here I've got some Unix binary, I think it's LPD, something like that. On the x-axis, we can see the total number of sequences executed by the program over time as it runs. And on the y-axis, we can see the number of unique short sequences of system calls. In this case, we're just looking at sequences of length 6. So you can see that as time passes, initially we're seeing a lot of new sequences, and then it's leveling off. In other words, we're getting a more compact definition of normal. Now, obviously, how rapidly you accumulate this definition of normal depends on how heavily used the system is. So the interesting thing about learning this kind of normal for systems you want to protect is that the more heavily and realistically used your system, the more effective the learning approach can be. So one of the important things to consider when you're thinking about this, as I mentioned before, is how does the system function online? It's very important to have be able to check each system call as it's made and do something about it, because you want to be able to stop attacks when they happen if you've got some sort of automated response system. And that means you have to have some very sort of efficient method of hooking the system calls, and you've got to minimize the overhead. So you've got to have a very effective and computationally low intensity system. The other thing to be aware of in these online environments is that they can be kind of noisy. Things can change. They might not be as static as you want. And so you want to be able to have flexibility to deal with noise in the environment. And what you might often find, and we've observed with a lot of experimentation, is that individual system calls may be made and they just indicate false positives if they're made in isolation. Whereas a lot of attacks, and this is by no means universal, but a lot of attacks do tend to generate clumps of unusual sequences of system calls. And the reason they do that is because you're executing some unusual code path, and that unusual code path usually involves several steps with a bunch of system calls. So one of the ways you can deal with this is you can have a moving window which aggregates the unusual sequences of system calls or the unusual system calls you see, and if the aggregate exceeds some threshold, then you would get an alert. And I've got a simple example down there. That binary string is just a representation where each 0 indicates a system call that's normal, and each 1 indicates a system call that's anomalous. And here my sliding window is of size 8, and I'm looking for anything that exceeds 4 unusual system calls within that size 8. So there's 2 instances there where I'll detect an anomaly. So using sort of those kinds of approaches, you can make the system more flexible. You can adjust it to an application that's perhaps less well-behaved than another application and noisier, and you can still get some level of protection. And here is an example of what I mean by clumping in an exploit. This is a fairly old exploit against syslog-d. And what we're seeing on the bottom axis, the x-axis, is the system calls as they're being executed. On the y-axis, we're seeing the aggregate number of unusual system calls or anomalous system calls. And so you can see there's a lot of clump behavior here. So thresholding is a good way of detecting this kind of thing. So there has been quite a bit of research into evading these kind of system call sequence monitoring methods. One of the most interesting of these is so-called mimicry attacks, where the goal here is to try and build a sequence of system calls that looks exactly like a normal sequence. We've had some very interesting theoretical analysis, but there's been no practical demonstrations of the efficacy of this approach because it's based on a couple of fundamental assumptions that may not hold often in the real world. The first assumption is that you can inject code because you need to be able to generate the code to look as you want. The second assumption is that you have an exact knowledge of what that normal model is or that normal profile. Now, if you've scanned the source code to build your normal profile, then anyone else can do so and get an exact model. But if you've built it by observing a behavior in an online environment, depending on your configuration and usage patterns, the attacker may have a great deal of difficulty knowing exactly what that normal profile looks like because it can vary a lot just by changing usage patterns. Anyway, so given that you have those two things, you know what the profile is exactly, and you can inject code, then the idea really is to create a so-called stealth sequence by inserting system calls that look normal in sequence but don't do anything. And you do this by nullifying the system calls. So you just generate system calls that have got arguments that don't do anything, basically. And as I said, David Wagner out of UC Berkeley has demonstrated this theoretically for very short sequences of system calls, sequence length 6. And as I'll describe, the problem becomes more difficult as the sequence length that you're monitoring goes up. Another way of trying to evade these systems is if you're only looking at the sequence or the ordering in which the system calls occur, then trying to change the parameters is another potential way of attacking. And that's obviously, it also has its own tricks because you've got to kind of know what those excuse me, original parameters were, and you've got to somehow change the parameters without affecting the normal behavior. And obviously this is going to be much easier to do if you can inject code. People have talked about this. We haven't seen effective demonstrations to date. I'm sure it's no doubt possible. And then, of course, the third way of breaking these systems is to subvert the system call hooking mechanisms, however they may be implemented in your system. And we've had some great talks from Eugene about how to do these kinds of things, so I'm not going to touch on that much here. So here is an example of a mimicry attack. We have a detection system where we're looking at sequences of length 6. So we're looking at very short sequences. And what this mimicry attack does is it builds up a stealth sequence of 134 system calls, 136 system calls, in which 128 of them are nullified, they do nothing, and 8 do what you want them to do and execute. So you can see there's quite an explosion here of the number of system calls you have to insert as nullified system calls in order to get a few legitimate system calls to execute. So how do we deal with mimicry attacks and the other kinds of attacks? And fortunately, there are some fairly straightforward ways of dealing with these things. The first is just simply to increase the sequence length. So you could see from the previous example that with a very short sequence length of 6 that you're monitoring, you need a lot of nullified system calls to generate anything useful. Now, if you increase your sequence length from 6 to 16, which you can often do by packing into bytes and things like that without much computational overhead, you could potentially exponentially increase the length at which that stealth sequence needs to be. And also, not only that, increase the amount of time needed to generate the stealth sequence. And if you think about increasing the length of the stealth sequence, that becomes very problematic because if you're trying to inject that that stealth sequence via buffer overflow, you might not have space for 10,000 system calls. The other ways you can deal with the mimicry attacks, of course, is that you can just make sure that code isn't injected. And obviously, the industry's got various ways of trying to do that, and we've seen various ways of breaking that. But if you do that, you have to make sure you get it right, obviously. And then talking about other kinds of attacks rather than mimicry attacks, and that's changing the parameters. There are potentially ways you could deal with that by looking at the parameters and trying to understand what parameters are normally used. Obviously, that's a harder problem. You can also use some information to detect nullified system calls that are potentially injected by just simply looking at the return calls, because return calls are going to be different frequently for the system calls as used normally versus as used as nullified system calls. And so the final thing I'm going to touch on in the anomaly detection sphere is false positives. So assuming that you're not doing some sort of code scanning of static code, you are potentially going to get false positives. And there's many different reasons for this, and it's worth understanding what the reasons are and how to deal with those issues, because in a lot of times you can deal with these issues and make the system effective. So the first way you can get anomalies is if you have an incomplete definition of normal because the way you've constructed it, maybe you've learned it in the production environment, you could get things like infrequent events like log file rollovers that cause anomalies. Another way you could get anomalies is through signaling and other kinds of change in control. So when control chops from one thread to another, and you have to make sure that you're monitoring threads individually. Also, things like asynchronous I/O can cause changes in sequence. And things like resource usage. So if you are running your system and the network gets busy for some completely different reason, it may be that suddenly you have to store more of your packets and your memory usage goes up, and that puts you in a different program regime, and that changes the sequence of the system calls. And then finally, another sort of thing is unusual error conditions. Maybe there's something that's unavailable in your program, goes into an error condition, and generates an unusual sequence. So some of the ways of dealing with these issues, the first is you can have exception mechanisms whereby when you understand what the false positive is, you can designate it as an exception and get it incorporated into your model of normal so that it doesn't trigger alerts again in future. And this can be very effective for dealing with the infrequent normal events like a log file rollover. And the good thing about this approach is you can gradually, incrementally improve the accuracy of your system as these infrequent events happen and pass by. Another way you can do it is correlation. So you can look at information from potentially other detection systems, other security systems, and try and understand when you're both detecting something unusual, and if that's clearly a threat, then you know the rest are false alarms. You can also do what I term secondary analytics, and Dom's going to go into quite a bit of detail about what these can be, but it's the idea where you gather more information to understand what an anomaly really is. And using that information, you can potentially categorize it as something like increasing memory usage due to some problems on the network, and hence know that it's a false positive. And then, of course, you can build in case-specific mechanisms for things like signaling and threading and asynchronous I/O. And the final point I want to touch on briefly, and Dom will talk about more, is the idea of benign responses, where instead of just responding by blocking something as if it were bad, you perhaps do something like slow it down. So you buy time for human beings to interject and try and understand what's going on. So in summary, if you're thinking about evaluating an anomaly detection system, if you're thinking about building an anomaly detection system, there's a bunch of things that you really have to be aware of. And the first is you have to know what characteristics are valuable in your domain that you're using it in. And there are many different kinds, and some are better than others. You also have to be aware of the anomaly detection method that you're using, and as I said, there's lots. And they have different efficacies, and they have different properties depending on where you're applying them. And they also have different computational efficiencies, and it's frequently the case that, say, in academic literature, people like to focus on the most fancy, clever algorithms that are often the least computationally efficient because that's the most interesting to them, and those are often the least practical in the real world. And as I mentioned before, there's many different techniques and ways of building up the profile of normal, and how you do that depends a lot on your environment and your resources, things like that. I'd also talked a bit about mimicry attacks and the ways of dealing with mimicry attacks, and also false positives and the ways of dealing with those. And at this point, Dom is going to give you some more information.
Thank you.
Bear with me for a second here.
I love killing PowerPoint. So let me see, is there any points I want to make on the tail end of Steve's presentation? just a couple ones just for clarification, right? We are talking about looking at system calls, and so you've seen a couple times today, I think, that a lot of both host-based intrusion prevention systems that exist on the market, as well as things like buffer overflow protectors, have been trying to do things like hook particular attributes of the kernel. And in order to actually work, those hooks need to maintain residency, and they need to be effective. And so, you know, if the system's not implemented well and somebody can get code into the kernel, you know, there's obviously a subversion path there, and that's just something that you need to be aware of in these systems, and it's something to understand. And it's much harder on Windows to get that right than it is, for instance, on Unix. Can you hold on? We're gonna have a good question. So, you know, some classic examples on Linux. If somebody attacks a process that runs as root and they get root, and dev kmem is writable to root, which you shouldn't do. You should fix your system so it's not. But it's as simple sometimes as grepping through dev kmem to find particular you know, sequences that sort of show you where a function exists. And you can actually use dd to simply like write a few instructions over that to just sort of jump back to someplace else. And so that's like how easy it can be sometimes on systems if they're not well protected. And some of the stuff that we saw today on Windows was that there are a number of APIs that allow you to load drivers into the kernel. And you know, systems that exist on those need to actually make sure that they protect against, you know, unloading or subversion through those mechanisms. The other one that Steve pointed out was that, for instance, mimicry attacks and stuff like that, it might be possible to create this long sequence of system calls, but if you think about the constraints of, for instance, buffer overflows, the most common way to inject code in, you know, usually have a fixed size amount of code that you can get in, and it takes a couple operations or a number of bytes a piece to call a system call. And so, you know, multiply by, oh, I'd have to do the calculation, but I think it's at minimum about 4 or 6 bytes of assembly to call a system call, maybe a little bit more. So you start multiplying that out, and you start seeing pretty quickly that if it goes on any more than a couple hundred system calls, it's probably not possible to deliver it under most buffer overflows. And the common way to deliver lots of code through overflows these days is to basically, the first part of the overflow is essentially like a little loader, and then over the network connection, it'll stream, you know, either more codes, more bytes, or proxy system calls. And so that loader itself, it's highly unlikely that somebody could ever implement that in the constraints of the system call sequence that would pass as normal on the system. And because it itself would have to get expanded out. And so it makes that, in a practical level, very difficult attack to actually implement. And then, for instance, system call proxying essentially looks like a read some arbitrary system call on the right, and that's basically reading the system call number, reading the arguments that are going to go into the registers, and executing the system call and writing the response back out of the socket. Basically, no program does that. I mean, you just don't see that sequence very often, and it repeats infinitely as somebody runs code. Another thing to just give a concrete example of Steve talking about performance aspects of some of these algorithms. You can find algorithms that have like 0 false positives and detect almost everything. And an example is the self-distance algorithm in Underkoffer's work. However, it actually uses n log n and log in order to do a lot of what it does, which is floating point operations. And for instance, in the Linux kernel, you can't do floating point. So you can implement this by doing fixed point math, but it just makes the implementation harder and you know, more work to be done. And so it's just one of those considerations for people who are actually looking to play around with some of this stuff and doing research and thinking about it, is that, you know, you actually have to understand some of the constraints in the environment that you're actually going to implement it in. And you might say, hey, this thing that not quite as perfectly accurate may be much easier and much more performant, like in the real world implications. And then a good example of attack against like semantic constraint, like I talked about systrace, right? Systrace has like 2 models. You can either run the program and it'll see all the system calls that the program makes and the arguments, and it tries to just derive a profile from that, and you can hand tune it if you want to, or you can actually write out in a simple file format, like these system calls can happen and this one can take these arguments. A classic example would be like a web server, which has logging and it does domain name resolution on the logs, right, or whatever. So it needs to be able to do DNS lookups. So in its profile, it does send and receive UDP to any arbitrary host on port 53. So shellcode can easily use that as a control channel, right? And then look at Dan Kaminsky's thing on every crazy thing you can do over DNS, and you start going, wow, you know, if you can do that, you basically have an arbitrary open communication channel to the world. And so, you know, in this case, if you're actually looking at sequences of system calls, you know, it's unlikely that the application would sit around and do tons of DNS queries, you know, in the context just after receiving data. And so it's highly likely that trying to use this control channel over DNS would really trigger an anomaly when you're looking actually at the sequences. So it might be some cases that you want to look at the semantics of each system call, but probably you really need to pay attention to sort of the time domain, you know, and how they're executed. And I'm not going to talk about loose signatures. Signature-based stuff sucks, right? If you know that there's a problem and somebody's written a signature for it, there might be a patch for it. If there's not a patch for it, you probably can figure out the signature and figure out how to block it someplace too. And you know, if you can't, you probably have more problems operationally as a security company or a company that has security people in it. So you know, I'm kind of being an idealist here, and there is some value in certain cases, but I just think that if you look at this world where you get patches, and I don't know if you saw Halvar's presentation, but it's not just one instance. There are many instances where the patches themselves included new vulnerabilities. So great, I patch my box, and you know, there's about maybe 50 or 100 people who are actively disassembling every patch that comes out for any interesting operating system, and they just discovered that, hey, there's a new entrance vector, and I'm going to run along and pop a bunch of boxes with that. And so we really have to think that we do need detection mechanisms that provide defense in those time windows before a good patch is available, and even possibly after the patch, because the patch itself might not fix the problem. It might fix a subset of the problem, or it might introduce new problems. So, you know, that's just kind of, I want to lay out a general scope of why I think this stuff is very important. Sync my slides here, so let me check time. Ooh, getting late. So we talked about, Steve went over doing sort of anomaly detection off of looking at sequences of system calls. Talked about there's some other mechanisms there. So this concept of co-stimulation, and really what I define that is, so say you have an anomaly detect, there's so much more information that's available on the system. So for instance, the open network connections to the process that actually generated the anomaly, the file access history, right? So essentially you can profile, keep a running cache of what file accesses looked like, or there's a number of smart ways you could do it. System resource utilization, you know, what's the stack size of the program at the time? What's the heap size? How many open files to have? What are the link counts? There's a bunch of interesting information in there that can be relevant. And another thing, what's the code size of the program? You actually pretty easily can determine whether or not something's been, you know, backdoored or had a Trojan inserted in it, because as you profile this program over a while, you know, the code size of the program is going to stay fixed. If somebody replaces it, updates it, makes a binary patch to it, unless they've actually just binary patched over code that's not normally executed and not caused any expansion, you know, this will just show up as an easy sort of thing, like, is the code right? Another thing is, what's the value of the user mode instruction pointer? So it turns out when a system call is made, the instruction pointer, which points to the next instruction that the program is going to execute from userland, actually gets pushed on the stack in the kernel, and it's available to the kernel it can look at. And that instruction pointer is actually incremented, so it'll point to the instruction after in most cases, the interrupt dispatch call. So the int80 on Linux or the int2e on Windows. And so, for instance, I wouldn't call it, you know, stack protection, but that's what some other people are trying to call it. But simply looking at that and looking into the segment and where it exists and whether or not that segment's writable, whether or not it's an anonymous segment, it's the heap segment or the stack segment, it'll catch the most trivial cases where it's a straight stack, you know, overflow, and somebody's, you know, not doing a return into libc, they're just trying to execute code off the stack, or they're just trying to execute, you know, code off the heap or something like that, this instruction pointer is going to point at code that's not in a code segment. And a code segment usually is just Rx. And so previous talk about overflow protection, they talked about segmentation on x86. And so you don't have it on a per page basis, but a segment's actually a linear range of addresses. And so when the program's loaded, the code's loaded into one, and that set is Rx. The data's loaded into an RW, and then the heap and the stack are actually like RXW, and so they're read-writable and executable. So that's just a simple check, and it's not a true check of whether or not you've been exploited, but it's something that it's a really good indicator in the most basic cases. Another one is whether or not the process is exec, and that means whether or not it's actually changed the binary it's running within the process. And so there's a number of ways you can just set that as a flag, or you actually can keep a history, of what's exec over the course. And if you know that that program shouldn't exec other stuff, we can just sort of set an a priori profile, like we don't ever expect this program to exec anything else. And at the time an anomaly occurs, you look, and if you see that it's running a different binary, well, there's really good chances that you probably just had a buffer overflow and somebody execs something. Another thing is change in user context. Is the system running on or is the process running under a different UID than it normally does, or that you would expect? And that could be somebody doing, basically switching privilege because the program didn't drop set UID properly, and before they're going in and doing their code, they're just restoring it to root. Another little interesting one that I haven't implemented is unhandled segmentation fault counter per binary, so not per process. And so segmentation fault, an unhandled one, would be when a program tries to reference a memory address that's not mapped into the process space and doesn't actually correlate with a page that should be mapped. And that's usually, on Unix, when you see sig11 segmentation fault and your program dies, that's what it is. So if you have a binary, right, and it gets run through a number of processes, and you keep a counter of how often it actually seg faults, and you see that starting increasing, what might that be? Who could answer? I know some guys right down here know exactly what that would be, but what could it be an indication of? Does anybody know? Yeah, offset brute forcing. So somebody's trying to execute a buffer overflow, and they don't know what the offset is, and they're just sort of trying to brute force through it, and they're causing the program to crash over and over again. It's restarting. It's just another thing that's there. It's a possible co-stimulator for that. So let's see. Let me jump on to the next slide. So as far as algorithms for co-stimulation, so there's a lot of data that's present, and we get that data, but we actually need a mechanism for looking at that data and evaluating it given the context and seeing whether or not something bad's happening. So you could have everything from like simple conditional rules. If these things are present, for instance, if EIP is in a writable segment, like I'm just going to assume this thing is bad, and I think it's a high severity, it's probably a buffer overflow, take some suitable response. Another thing is you can do Bayesian decision networks, and this is, given a large set of those attributes, you can either teach a network or you can manually tune one that says, hey, these things have different weighting, and if they essentially accumulate up to a score that's high enough, like I think this thing is bad, or I think it's severity X. And you can do interesting things in those. For instance, like you can put conditionality between two. So for instance, you might have one that's very good representation, except if another one has occurred, if there's a different attribute present on the system. And so you can get really accurate through these because you can build conditionality between those and say, so if attribute X is present, really de-weight the value of Y. And so that's like a really good way to get a pretty precise thing. Another thing is you can use PCA, or principal component analysis, and we can just collect through training, and this is something you'd sort of do more on the research side, but collect a bunch of these data sources through training, and then use PCA to determine which ones actually give the most value at determining whether or not this program is normal or operating outside of normal. Another interesting thing that's not quite the same thing, but closely related is Underkoffer built essentially a target-centric attack ontology, and what that means is that he looked at 4,000 different attacks over the course of 10 years, and looked for common attributes or classifications of that attacks, but looked at it from the perspective of, if I'm the machine being attacked, how would this affect me? And what are the attributes that are measurable on the system that would indicate that it's this particular kind of attack? And so he built a taxonomy of those, and he built an ontology, which is essentially a taxonomy with the logical constraints and relationships between the elements. And he built a system that would export a bunch of this data, or the most interesting data, and he would insert that as facts into a first-order logic system, and then ask the system, so what's going on? And the system would come back, hey, that looks like a buffer overflow in that process, or that looks like a memory consumption denial of service. And even to the point of where if he had data from multiple machines, could see things like TCP sequence number spoofing, because he'd have a connection purported to be from one machine, and that machine would be suffering a denial of service currently and couldn't possibly be the other endpoint. So a very powerful mechanism for sort of, if the thing comes back and goes, I think it's normal, you go, oh, well, maybe this is a false positive then, or not anything that I care about. So the point kind of being is there's a tremendous amount of great academic work in this area, but like a lot of academic work, we actually don't have any code that works and that we can play with. And so one of my points is that, though there are intrusion prevention products coming out, and they're definitely ones with tremendous promise, and actually they deliver value right now, it'd be really great for a lot more people to be able to play around with different kinds of implementations and see in their operational environments, what are the downfalls, or where is this delivering value, and where is it, where is it leaving me with like, okay, great, I got an anomaly and I don't know what to do about it, right? Because that can be a real issue. So I'll get to what I'm trying to do about that. If I can find my pointer again. Ooh, there it is. So now, kind of to the response point. So assuming we can kind of co-stimulate when we have an anomaly and determine sort of the severity of the anomaly, or whether or not it's of a class that's, that we view as malicious or we want to protect against, we need escalating responses. Doing coarse response, like terminating a process, shutting down a system, putting in a firewall rule, blocking a network, those are pretty coarse. And you probably should stay away from them under cases except where you know exactly what's happening. So what we need is fine-grained response mechanisms. And as Steve pointed out, there's a number of things that we actually consider benign responses, where they buy us time to gather more information and evaluate what's going on. For instance, that might be delaying system calls for short periods of time where the application continues to run. Therefore, it doesn't lose any state. And some people found that, for instance, like if you denied system calls arbitrarily, like passing back, like, nope, that didn't work. Actually, just like many programs have bugs that are security vulnerabilities, many programs have bugs where they don't check responses, and they go along thinking that the operation actually succeeded. And there was one, I forget which academic paper it was in, but it was actually a really good point where this program tried to drop privileges through setuid, and so if they failed setuid because they thought, oh, this might be a buffer overflow trying to, revert privileges, the program didn't even notice, and it just kept on running as root, like connected to the network and doing all sorts of stuff that it shouldn't be doing as root. So, it might be a better idea to temporarily slow the program down while you gather information, while you buy a little time for a human to get into the loop if that's sort of the policy direction you want to go, or to figure out, okay, I think this thing is really bad and I am going to terminate it, or something else. So I like to start sort of, hey, one thing is just record all the relevant information. Like, let's get a really good log of what this thing was doing. So let's record all the network connections that were actually open to this process. Let's grab all the relevant information about it. And so for instance, like what files were open at the time, what open descriptors. I grabbed the memory map, environment variables, the user context it was running on, current binary that's actually executing, and the instruction pointer. And then another thing that you can do is you can even let the process keep running, but you can actually sort of generate a core dump, or at least selectively dump particular memory segments. So for instance, if you know what instruction pointer was at the time the system call was made, well, you dump the memory segment that contained that, and if you know where the EIP was, you simply can just disassemble it and see what the code was within context. And so, yeah, the average security ops guy isn't going to do that, but you know, eventually you could probably get the data to somebody who can look at it and go, hey, yeah, this looks like it was something really bad going on. And at least the very far point is you get these anomalies, you don't know what they are, you know, you're either blocking them or you're letting them go, but you can turn around and send this data to the vendor, and the vendor's got people who hopefully can analyze it, and they look at it and go, yeah, this looks like it's a new attack that nobody knows about, and you know, figure out that and tell you what it is, and you know, it gets taken care of eventually. And so one of my gripes with almost all intrusion detection systems is they don't give you enough data, whether or not for a computer to analyze it or for a human to analyze it, to really, like in a case of where, like, okay, it's an O-Day attack or it's a worm that, you know, just started to spread, for anybody to actually go, oh, this is something we haven't seen before. And they really need to do that, because otherwise they're really not useful. They just generate a bunch of alerts that you either disregard or you run around like madmen, like thinking that, you know, a machine's compromised and not knowing for sure that it is and not knowing exactly what is compromised. Another one is fail or grant access to specific files or other system resources. So a really kind of interesting thing is if you're actually profiling the system resource usage as part of your training, and you know, you do get an anomaly, one of the things you can do is just go, okay, well, I'm telling this process and I'm going to constrain it to only do things that it's ever done before. So it can only read or write to the files that it did before. It can only open network connections to hosts that it's opened, you know, network connections to before. You know, whatever the case of it, you know, you can imagine the extent that you could go. And so, you know, it may be compromised, but at least you can say, you know, I'm limited to scope of what it can do. And so that's a really valuable mechanism that could potentially, you know, hinder an attacker if they do take control of the process, or hinder a worm from spreading, for instance, but not cause the application to actually stop doing what it was doing. And I'll get a little bit more to that point in a bit. So I said introduce system call delays, and that could be relative to the severity or sort of as defined by system developer. And one of the things I was working on, I actually take the process and put it on a wait queue with the timeout, and the user land goes ahead and looks at it, and if it thinks it's okay, it releases a process, but if it times out, it starts resuming execution, and that way my system is robust in case the user land fails or doesn't start up or anything like that, and that way even if something's doing anomalies, I'm not causing it to fail closed. But in some other environments, for instance, you have an environment where confidentiality and integrity is really important and availability is not as important, you might want to fail closed. And so that is like, if something doesn't come back and tell me, yes, this process should continue running, it gets killed. Another one is terminate specific network connections versus, and that is like on the host. You see a network connection is connected to this process. So for instance, you might know that this program should actually never communicate with external parties. It should only communicate with things on your local LAN. And at the time you see the anomaly, there's a network connection to a non-local LAN address. Terminate it, right? And you know, alert, and then maybe somebody goes ahead and puts a block in at some point, someplace else. And then at the highest level would be terminate the process itself. And I would say that for now, response selection should probably remain like a human definable thing. But what we need is fine-grained responses like this, that the actual user knowing their production environment, knowing the availability requirements of their system, also the confidentiality that's sort of necessary for the data on that box, or the integrity that's necessary, something that they can string together. And so when the co-stimulation kind of happens, that classification needs to be something that's human mappable. Human needs to be able to look at it and go, okay, so for either, basically code path changes, things like buffer overflows, like I want to take this level of response. For things that look like denial of services, I want to take this other level of response. Things that I don't know about, I just want to collect some more information on, right? And send an alert or not send an alert. And this is another place where, like, if the system just doesn't think it's interesting, maybe you just don't generate alert, or at least not alert off to an ops console that gets people all fired up about it. Maybe you just write it off to syslog or something. Sorry about my slow slide navigation here. Oh, I also wanted to make a couple points about, so I actually work in an environment where, I've got systems that if they go down, they cost millions of dollars an hour, and that equates to like $500 a second in downtime. So if I have a worm and it costs me $300,000 to, mitigate and clean up after, that sort of correlates to, 15 minutes of downtime on my system. The chances are, I don't want to do anything that might cause system downtime. And I really just rather know that an event's going on and get somebody there to know that, for instance, maybe this worm is just trying to propagate and it doesn't actually do anything else. If that's the case, I'll try to take some steps to slow its propagation down so I don't have to clean up as many hosts. But, who really cares? I'd rather keep my business up and I'd rather keep money flowing. Excuse me for a second. I'd rather keep money flowing, than try to actually stop this thing from taking hold of the system. Versus you might have an environment, take military, intelligence community, where they could suffer some downtime, but they cannot yield control of that machine to anybody else because of the nature of the data, or what's moving through it. And that needs to be something that a human at this point responds, because, I don't know a way to make software smart enough to go, hey, this system's my backend database that transacts all my financial application stuff, and don't shut it down. And I think Mark from EI made a good point about, one IPS system that protected against a particular worm that was exploiting RPC on a Windows box, but XP and so forth had this really great thing that if the RPC service dies, or actually LSA dies, it reboots within 30 seconds. So, the exploit was actually causing corruption within the process, but it wasn't allowing the code to run. So the machine technically wasn't being infected by the worm, but it was rebooting every 30 seconds. And if you've ever seen a worm, particularly this one, if it got the offset right, it was, going for SP1 versus SP2. You watched your box on the network, reboot every time, come up, get hit again, reboot. And so that's a denial of service. So it turned this attack from gaining control of a machine to denial of service to a machine. In some environments, that might be a preferable thing to do. In others, it just may not be kosher at all. And so that's a real thing that, I think anybody who's looking at these systems need to understand. And anybody who's writing these systems needs to take into account, and the systems need to be configurable for that kind of environment, a dialable little knob. So a stupid simple example is you get an anomaly in a system sequence call, and the process is exec, and you have a profile that says this process doesn't exec anything else. Process has open network connections, and the instruction pointer is in a writable memory segment. So a possible response might be to grab all the state information about the process, dump the memory segment containing EIP, terminate the process, and issue an alert. So anybody in here, if the process is exec, the process has open network connections, and the instruction pointer is a writable memory segment, what kind of attack is that probably? Does anybody know? Yeah, buffer overflow. Interesting enough, I've got a stupid little system that, if this was to occur, I would actually dump the memory segment that happened in, and I actually would capture the shellcode of the exploit, which is kind of interesting from a forensic perspective, because not only can I see what the shellcode does, but I actually have the exact shellcode as delivered by the exploit. And if that happened to be a novel attack and the source code for it wasn't broadly spread, if I happened to find the person, which is unlikely, that probably did it, you would actually have the best forensic information that's possibly available on a computer, and it's equivalent to tool marks in the real forensics world. Say, that tool, that piece of source code that was sits on a system, delivers this. And it's not conclusive, but it's much better than what we currently have. And oh, by the way, no file system-based forensic analysis would ever give that to you. And I'm actually not a big believer in file-based forensic analysis, except for when you're looking for people keeping spreadsheets of their illegal gambling stuff and storing child porn. But for system compromise, most current exploit methodologies don't write to the file system. They exploit a process, they inject code in the process, they do stuff, they possibly fork and exec the process, so they might read something off the file system, but it's probably, in the case of a shell, something that gets executed all the time, and therefore it probably gets executed again by some background cron job, and so the access time, is totally bogus anyways. So, any of these things need to actually get to the point where they collect information that might actually allow you to see what the hell went on. And if you get really lucky, you get a new exploit. So, and we all like to collect exploits. Or maybe we don't. So, sort of a whole where we need to go. I'm really not talking about perfect security. I'm talking about trying to increase operational security. Trying to get to automated response could definitely decrease the amount of time that humans spend responding to events, cleaning up systems. Definitely can protect us against a large class of attacks automatically. But also that any system that's built in this space really needs to give us better information, and it really needs to take sort of operational considerations like what the hell does this machine do and what would be an appropriate response on this machine to account. If it gives us enough information that a computer can reason over it or run an algorithm to determine whether or not it's normal, it's probably enough information for a human to do the same thing. And so it's sort of a win-win in that case. Even if you don't decide to do any kind of automated response, at least there's data that maybe not a standard like security ops person could interpret, but eventually it could get to somebody who could interpret it and really give you a conclusive analysis of what happened in that case, whether or not it was a false positive or whether or not it was actually something malicious. So I'm not going to talk too much about this other wrap-up because we're running out of time, but what I am working on, it's not complete yet. I was hoping I could actually show it, is an automated defense framework. And essentially what it is I looked at a number of projects like systrace, as well as I've actually implemented an anomaly detection system, but it's for a company. I can't give it away. And I looked at, there's some very common things on Linux, because that's what I work on, that need to do. And that's, for instance, you need to know when a process exec. You need to know when it terminates. You need to know when it forked, because that's when it gets created. You need to be able to look at each system call. And if you look at things like LSM, which is loadable security modules, it's great for doing things like SE Linux, but it's completely retarded for doing anything like intrusion detection, because it doesn't allow you to see all the system calls that are made, nor the parameters. It only cares about when you act on security critical objects. So there's really a gap here as far as being able to do anything, including just collecting evidence about like what system calls are being made. So I decided I wanted just to implement like a generic framework that would make it so researchers, or even if somebody wants to build, a commercial product on it, I don't care. I'm not actually going to license the code. That has some just sort of standard like, function calling mechanisms that people can just provide the functions that actually do the anomaly detection algorithm or do some of the response mechanisms that they want, and they can just plug it in, and the rest of the code, does all the hard stuff, deals with the synchronization on multiple processors, and provides a communication and control mechanism between the kernel component and the userland component. So my model here is that you need to do the detection and analysis, of the system call sequences and stuff like that in kernel for performance reasons, and also the fact that it's separated from user code, and as long as your kernel's not compromised, it can take strong enforcement. It can kind of trust the information that it has. But there's a lot of stuff that you want to do, and a lot of information is available in userland, and you might as well write the code up there. It's easier to implement. It's easier to debug. It's safer if it crashes. It doesn't cause your box to die a horrible death. And so I'm building a Python sort of daemon framework with some interesting analysis tools, like the ability to dump memory segments and to collect the network connections that are open to the process at the time, to evaluate that to determine whether or not that's a server, so that's a client connected to this process, or whether or not it's this process connecting to something else. So for instance, you can build constraint policies around that and say, hey, this program only should ever, get connections from internal clients. and if that's the case, then great. If it notices that it has a connection from an external client, you go, oh, that's probably bad. Or if it's making an outbound connection, like your web server making outbound connection, probably not something it normally does. Probably a good indicator that you've got a compromise in progress. And so the kernel component also exports a bunch of information that's hard to get from user land about the process and makes it valuable. And so I'm really hoping that even if just one smart guy in school or woman in school takes this thing and comes up with something great, it would be pretty cool. But also, as I work on and other people work on it, I hope to implement just some of these base models, and so people can actually get this and kind of choose, from a number of options, put it on their system and run it, and at least get some experience and play with it, and either put it in operation or at least understand, maybe give some feedback, or write papers, whatever, about what would be better or what needs to be done in order to make it useful. So my website's actually pinky.hexoff.org. It's on the slides. There is a kernel patch for 2.4.26 that it's not fleshed out, it's not clean, and it actually has a wicked bug in it that will crash your box eventually. And but over the course of the next like 2 months, but it's available if anybody wants to look at it and see where I'm going, or anybody wants to work on the project. I'm open to both. But hopefully over the next month or two, I'll actually get it wrapped up for a version 1.0 with these things there. And I also would like it to sort of force commercial vendors maybe to, generate more information from their stuff and maybe feel a little competitive pressure that they have to deliver something better because there's something free available. So that's where I'm kind of going with that. So any questions? Yes, Dennis. Yeah. So that's what there was some. There was an academic system that would limit, and actually systrace will do it too in certain cases where if it calls a system call and the policy says that it can't call that system call, it'll just return an error code on it, and that can trigger nasty little bugs. I kind of mentioned one of them, and it's probably not the appropriate thing to do most often, and it's probably appropriate to do if you have a good profile of what the resource usage should look like for that program, and you limit the program to its common, execution paths and its common resource utilizations, and only, deny it things that are totally abnormal. But just sort of arbitrarily doing it is probably a bad idea, Who knows, and if nothing else, it opens to simple denial of services by, if you can just tickle it down just like a slightly abnormal path, you don't even get control over it. You just trip up an error condition that's, never been seen or wasn't in the profile, and the thing goes, and kills the process. That's a bad idea, right? Yeah, I mean, there's a number of bad things. Oh, and so that was also a point that I didn't mention is, my first naive notion was like, I will dump the whole process address space of this program that's doing the anomaly so I can analyze it, and I have everything. In my environment, unfortunately, I have literally about 10 processes per box that have over a gig virtual memory size apiece. And so, if my automated response dumps the whole process space, it's just a bad thing on, an 80 gig hard drive. So I selectively dump, things like the process or the segment that EIP's in, and then possibly the anonymous and heap and stack segments if they're not ridiculously big. And that way I probably have enough state information about what the program was doing. So I'll have variables on the stack and on the heap, and I'll have the code that was executing. I probably can figure out pretty well exactly what was going on. So that's probably a better thing to do. And I had this notion a long time ago and never implemented. I think there are some other people. I heard that Encase now has this enterprise edition that it can hook up to IES systems and it can do evidence capturing, and they do capture some volatile information. But I have no idea about it. I've never seen it, and I don't know if it's naive, smart, or whatnot. So, but it's one of those things. Anybody else? Okay, go drink. Thanks a lot.